Iain Mattaj. I came to EMBL in 1985 from Basel in Switzerland. It was my first independent position as an investigator. And I stayed at EMBL for a very long time. I left at the end of 2018, beginning of 2019, having gone through almost every position from group leader upwards before reaching my level of incompetence and moving away.
So Iain, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this alumni chat and to welcome you, of course, as an alumnus of the EMBL organisation. We're talking here today in Edinburgh, and I know, like myself, you hail from Scotland originally. How did you first get interested in science?
I was interested in science from an early age. The thing that decided me to enter a scientific discipline on going to university, having been influenced, I must say, there was one botany teacher in the high school I attended who was very enthusiastic and very good, and he taught us about the Krebs cycle, which you will know well. And then I became interested in biochemistry. And people who know me know that I'm very impatient. And I knew I wanted to go to Edinburgh University. And biochemistry was the first degree in the life sciences. So I applied for biochemistry and nothing else. And luckily I was accepted. And that started me on the trail to life sciences. I then did a PhD in Leeds University, which was a complete disaster. And I was rescued by visiting Basel in Switzerland to visit a friend. And the friend was doing a PhD in the Friedrich Miescher Institute in Switzerland. And his supervisor, while I was there, we spoke a couple of times, and he said, if you want to come to do a PhD, you'd be very welcome to join my lab. And I have money from the Friedrich Miescher Institute to pay you. And so I did, went to there, and that was an even worse disaster because I ended up working on a project which was based on data which had been faked by other people, including the supervisor in the lab. And I discovered the basis of the fake results, and that was not particularly popular with my colleagues.
That didn't endear you to your supervisor.
Exactly. But luckily, Eddie de Robertis had just arrived in Basel. He was working in the Biocenter, and that was the beginning of my more successful science career. And Eddie's lab was super. He was very creative, very enthusiastic, very good at involving people in stories. He was a very, very, very good supervisor for me. So
you ignited your career in Eddie's lab, I think it would be fair to say. How did you end up in Heidelberg?
How did I end up in Heidelberg? So it was really chance. I did not know about EMBL. EMBL was 9 years old, roughly, when I applied. And it was not, nothing like as well known as it is nowadays. It was a young lab. It was quite a specialist lab. And it was simply unfamiliar to most people, including Eddie. But Eddie invited Marianne Bientz, was at the LMB at that time, working on heat shock genes. And she was in Zurich visiting friends, family, giving a talk. And Marianne came, and she said, you really should go and look at EMBL. It's super interesting. The way they support young people extremely well. And it would probably be a good place for you to build an independent career. So I wrote to Leonard Phillips, and I think at the time there was a kind of open call going on. And Riccardo Cortesi was just setting up what was called at the time gene structure and regulation. The day I went for interview, and it was a day, it was winter, it was very cold, bitterly cold, and it had rained and snowed the day before and the night before. But then in the morning, there was brilliant sunshine and blue sky and frozen rain on the trees. So I walked from the guest house in Boxberg through to EMBL with these tinkling branches all the way through the path from Boxberg. And it was so impressive. And then I spent the day talking to people in the lab. Leonard himself, in fact, I spoke to Leonard twice. Then I gave a talk, and there was an hour gap while they consulted with the people I had spoken to. And then Leonard called me back into his office, and he said, well, when do you start? And I was completely taken aback, but I had been so impressed by what I'd seen. If you go to places that are really good, yes, people always will find time to talk to you about what they're doing. Yes. If you go to places that are less good or mediocre, nobody wants to talk to you.
Yeah.
And so the excitement
yes,
transmits itself, yes, because they're all excited about what they're doing.
Absolutely, and I think that you don't need, and certainly my experience was, I never felt the pressure of you when you were the head of gene, yeah, expression when I worked there, or Leonard saying that there are milestones you have to reach.
Sure,
but I
yeah,
never felt more pressure from bottom
inside,
up,
because
I was, sure, surrounded by people doing, sure, stellar science,
sure,
and I was constantly feeling I'm not up to this. I better work harder to justify it.
Yeah, I think that's something which people also from the outside, these people are under too much pressure. You shouldn't go there. There's no pressure. You generate the pressure yourself, and it's exactly like that. You want to be part of this, yeah, group of people who are doing well,
and to live up to the very high standards.
Yeah.
And that really does come from leadership. So I'm sure you've learned a lot about leadership. As you said, you've gone through the whole process from group leader, head of division,
yeah,
scientific director, director,
yeah,
general. I guess that is a challenge to understand how to do that.
How to do that, and I'm sure there are many different models, but I think in a research institute, it's incredibly important to trust junior people at all levels. In your own lab, you have to trust the PhD students and the postdocs to just get on with their thing. You have to trust the group leaders to make the choices of what they want to study. They have to be free to make these choices. You can't micromanage in a research institute. It just doesn't work. You have to delegate. You have to let people, this is a phrase, or it's an opinion I share very much with Paul Nurse, who at one point in his career was asked, how do you make a successful institute? And he said, well, you just choose people who are good, and you get out of the way and just let them get on with it. And I think that's exactly right. I think any interference is negative.
We overlapped for 9 years. I had the privilege of starting my independent career there, initially with Ricardo, and then you took over as head of, yes, division. I look back on that as a golden age of my career. What are some of your highlights scientifically from your own research? Because you were very, very active yourself.
Yeah.
You were a leader, not just in leadership roles, but also, yeah, in research.
One of the first ones was, if you remember, when I first went to EMBL, I worked on the transcription of US and RNA, yes, genes, and they had promoters, and they have. It's a very interesting problem. They have promoters in each eukaryotic species. They all have the same set, more or less, of USNRNAs that are involved in splicing and in the removal of introns, They have SNO RNAs, which are involved in ribosomal RNA processing. And they have a few other small RNAs that are involved in things like making the 3' end of histone messenger RNAs, etc. So they all have this array of something like 27 or so USNRNAs. And all of these USNRNAs are short. They're very highly conserved between species in terms of the RNA sequence. And they have promoters which are different from all the other promoters in the cells that they're produced in. And these promoters, however, they evolve in two ways. One is that some of those RNAs are produced by RNA polymerase II and some by RNA polymerase III, but their promoters are extremely similar. And there are different ways of switching between RNA polymerase II and RNA polymerase III. In plants, for example, you do it by changing the distance between identical promoter elements. You just move them further apart, and you go from pol 3 to pol 2. In the case of the vertebrate USNRNAs, which is what I worked on, U6 was the one that was transcribed by RNA polymerase III, and the promoter was identical to those for the other USNRNAs that were involved in RNA processing, except that it had a Tata box centered at -25, which is the definition of messenger RNA polymerase II promoters. But U6 was a pol 2 promoter. U6 was a pol 3 promoter, sorry. Messenger RNAs are pol 2. And I remember the day when we discovered and proved that it was the Tata box that made the U6 promoter a pol 3 promoter rather than a pol 2 promoter. It was such an unexpected result. And I remember running along the corridor and yelling to probably you, to Riccardo Cortese, to Roberto Di Lauro, to Henk Stunenberg, to everybody who was around. David Tollerby was around. This is amazing. Look at this. It can't be true. And it was that was very exciting. And then I think there were multiple other discoveries. We were lucky, as you said, in being able to get good results in various different fields. But the next really big one was making spindle-like structures with RAN GTP, the small GTPase, which is involved in microtubule nucleation at the spindle, and many, many, many other things also. But I remember I was collaborating with Eric Carsonti on this. And I remember when we first got the result, where we showed that if you just took mitotic extract of Xenopus eggs and added RAN GTP, nothing else, the whole extract filled up with spindle-like structures. And not only that, but they were the same length as real mitotic spindles. And Eric, I remember saying, "Ah, mais ça c'est un grand poisson, ça." It was a big fish that we had caught. It was fabulous, and that was very exciting. Except everybody in the field of spindle generation thought they knew how spindles were generated, and there was no room for RAN GTP. And so it was actually very funny, because the results were very exciting. They were absolutely definitive. They were published very well, but nobody in the field believed it. And so every time we went to talk about these results to people from the field, they were incredibly negative and skeptical about it. But in the end, it turned out to be true.
I mean, it's just keeping that spirit of almost childlike
Absolutely.
pleasure.
We found something out.
Yes, exactly.
And who knew that this was the way it would work?
And so I wonder then if we could just move from that, the act of doing research
Yeah.
to persuading our political masters to fund
To
it.
fund it.
How did you manage to persuade people that is so important? And also this, we work in a vacuum where you don't know what you need to know
Yeah.
to benefit
Yeah. Absolutely.
economically or medically.
Absolutely.
And so the
Absolutely.
fundamental importance of basic research seems
Yeah.
so obvious probably to you and I and to
Absolutely.
many colleagues.
Absolutely.
And yet it isn't obvious to so many people. I heard quite a funny but probably very opposite comment recently that the problem for research and the challenge is we neither have support in Parliament or in the pubs.
Yeah.
And that idea that most politicians who ultimately decide typically don't have a scientific background,
Sure.
don't have that, and the quote man or woman in the street probably hasn't studied science and
Yeah.
maybe doesn't. So how did you meet that challenge, and how do we do it?
I think part of it is what you mentioned or what we discussed earlier. I think the transmitting the enthusiasm for discovery, but also just giving numbers. It's surprising there are not more studies of this type, but there's a very good study that was commissioned by the UK Medical Research Council. There's a similar study that was commissioned by NIH that shows the value to the country in perpetuity of the research done on cancer or cardiovascular disease or other common illnesses. And the numbers are astonishing. There's such a return on investment in terms of research in these areas, in terms of productivity, in terms of lifespan, in terms of lifestyle for people, etc., which turns into money for the country, in however you calculate that. So keeping a sort of keeping your eye on indicators that are positive, making sure that you keep repeating stories about the serendipity of scientific research that turned out to be useful. There are many, many examples of how findings that were extraordinarily valuable for society were made by pure chance in areas that were not considered to be of interest. Why would anybody want to look at why yeast that divide by getting longer and dividing in the middle into two pieces, why would anybody want to look at the defects of that process? But the results of the research on that process turned out to be one of the ways in, the footholds into understanding certain types of cancer. And that's who knew? That was not why the people were doing the research. They had no clue that this would have any consequence or relevance for higher eukaryotes. They were interested in how these yeast cells divided, and that's what they studied, and it turned out to be extremely useful.
Yeah, so the value of studying fundamental aspects of science,
Yeah.
but doing it excellently,
Yeah.
is really the prize, and the challenge is how do you explain that to people who don't have a scientific background?
Right.
As you say, did you find the politicians receptive to these arguments in general?
I think people were receptive, particularly when you could make financial arguments, like the arguments about the value of cardiovascular research or cancer research in the US and the UK, which were very well-funded studies. There were, at one point during my tenure at EMBL, EBI commissioned a study to look at the value to the country or the countries of what the EBI did. And again, the results are astounding. There's such a return on the investment to the EBI. These kind of arguments are non-scientific and work I think the other thing, and you mentioned this earlier in our chat, the other thing that was extremely useful was if politicians came to visit EMBL, just taking them around and letting them talk to people, talking to young people, seeing the enthusiasm, seeing what they were doing.
In your time at EMBL and across your career, I know you've also seen phenomenal changes in technology, because the field of research changes a lot from the work you did as a PhD student, a postdoc, a young group leader. The way you go about doing science now, it's not the same. You know, the methods really changed the art of the possible.
Absolutely.
How did you approach those challenges from a leadership position to foster innovation? Because EMBL's been always famous for technological leadership.
For being at the forefront. I think that's obviously an advantage that EMBL has, having a turnover system, that it's always possible to recruit young people. And I think partly it was not a one-person job to choose strategies and to look at what were the future directions. But having a group of colleagues who had very good taste in what were interesting new areas was the secret to recruiting people to move into new directions. And I must say that, you know, you're absolutely right. The most important areas of, you know, high throughput research, bioinformatics, artificial intelligence, imaging, these were all things in which I have no personal competence. But it was easy to see how important these were going to be to the future of research. And so it's, I think you don't have to be able to do things in order to grasp why new technologies are important. And and particularly, again, if you're in the right environment and you have really smart people who are looking ahead of the game for what's next, and, you know, who will only hire people if they're going to bring something new and creative to the mix in their programs or in their units.
I mean, something I've always felt passionately about from my own experiences is how much research is a truly transnational activity, and how much I've benefited from having the opportunity to work in different countries, see different ways of doing things in different situations, and to benefit from having colleagues and working within research teams, as I continue to do here, which are multinational.
Absolutely.
And bring people together and, you know, really care much less about where someone came from as to what they're interested in, what they're going to do.
And what they're going to do.
I mean, that's the hallmark of EMBL. Are you confident that if you look towards the future, that can continue? I mean, we see the signs, unfortunately, Britain choosing Brexit, America now apparently wanting to isolate itself and cut itself off and be very inward looking. How do we preserve that transnational?
I think this is obviously a time when the idea of internationalism and an international environment is being questioned. But there is, I think, the argument is that there is no logic to questioning the benefit of diversity in any activity. Having a diverse group of people who are aimed to achieve the same mission, the same goal, is always the best way to make progress. And there are millions of studies, social science studies, showing that diversity works. And so I think, luckily, so far, in terms of most of Europe, including the UK, I think that in relation to the support of the intergovernmental organizations, there is no indication that I'm aware of that the countries are saying we should only bring people from our own member states and we should exclude people from elsewhere. And one of the best examples of this in action is the EMBL PhD program. So that's a program which brings together people from many, many different countries. They have there are many different educational systems, almost as many as there are different countries. And so people come to EMBL with different training, different expectations. But once they've been in the PhD program, they've gone through the starting course and they've gotten started, and they have a group of connections with the other PhD students that enables them to kick off their own research project. Once they've been there for 10 weeks, it's impossible to tell which one came from X country and which one came from Y country. They're so plugged in and connected to the whole that they can do anything, because they can get the help that they need to do what they want to do.
Yeah, I mean, EMBL has been and continues to be a success at multiple levels, but I always felt that the PhD program was the jewel in its crown.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I was always in awe of the quality of the EMBL PhD students.
Yeah, exactly.
And, it was
but that's
just
one of the
fantastic.
things about your career, that when you're a postdoc, you understand that you would never be chosen to be a PhD student in the institute that you're in. When you're a group leader, you understand that you would never have been chosen to be a postdoc.
Yeah.
When you're the director of a department, you realize that you would never be chosen to be a group. And that's how it should be. People should continue to try to choose people who are better than they are. Because that's the secret to maintaining success.
Exactly, and indeed, I'm lucky I was able to apply to be a group leader at the time I did, because I wouldn't make the cut now. So looking towards the future, Iain, are you optimistic about how research can develop? Do you have any thoughts about how we can negotiate what does seem to be a rather difficult immediate prospect for the coming years ahead?
So by nature, I'm an optimistic person, and so I am optimistic about the future of research. I think that we are in a phase of where a number of countries are becoming hyper-nationalistic, are becoming almost fascistic in the way that they operate in certain aspects. But that will change. It's these things come and they pass, and I think I have a lot of faith still in the European nature of many of our most important organizations. I think, in one sense, the US, which is the powerhouse of scientific research, as well as of economic growth and economic benefit. If the US decides it doesn't want all these fantastic, smart people, it's an opportunity for the rest of the world. And I think that it's an opportunity that automatically will occur, because people who want to develop new things, who want to do new things, will not be happy to be constrained in one environment if they know that on the other side of the hill there's another environment where they can do what they want with fewer or no constraints. And so I think it's an opportunity. It will be short-lived, because I cannot believe that a country with the stability of the US, the basic stability, will not swing back in the other direction in a relatively short time. There are other countries about which I would be more concerned, including some European countries. But I think this is a temporary, I hope. And as I said, I'm an optimist. I think this is a temporary blip that hopefully we can forget in 15 years or so.
I completely concur with your views on the value of diversity. I think anyone who ever studied genetics realizes diversity is the superpower of a population.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And really making these arguments, and speaking very personally, but I hope it resonates with you, is that being involved over the last few years with the alumni activities and the alumni chats and the Coffee with EMBL events has really, again, been a very emotional thing for me, is seeing what a big reach EMBL has way beyond just the member countries. Bringing together in times of adversity like the COVID crisis, the whole community, and seeing the diaspora of EMBL trained scientists. I really see the organisation has been a huge force for good. And of huge value to society as well as economies throughout the world in a transnational way. Maybe as we wrap up, I'd be interested in your thoughts about how EMBL can continue to be a relevant driver of excellence in a leader in the years ahead.
Yeah, I think the EMBL is set up for the long term. And partly that was the chance of the period in which many of the European intergovernmental organizations were set up. That the organizations were set up with where their governing councils, so the member states, had an enormous level of freedom to decide how they would be organized, how they would be run, etc. And because the organization has the freedom to renew, and not only the freedom, but it has to renew, because whatever the percentages of people come for 9 years, and then they have to move on. And so there's no choice about having to renew. And so as long as you have people, senior people in the laboratory who are involved in hiring researchers, but also involved in hiring administrators, etc., who are creative, who buy into the idea of the administration has to be there to enable science to occur, not the opposite. And the researchers have to be there in order to do the best possible science they can do over a period of 9 years. And they're given the environment, the freedom, simply also the money to get started with this, and then they can raise external money themselves. I think it's a model which doesn't have a sell-by date. It will continue to work as long as you can choose the right people to run it.